Mark Hamilton had spent decades working himself to the bone, building his business from the ground up, making the right investments, and ensuring that when the time came to finally step away, he could do so without looking back. He had sacrificed nights, weekends, and relationships, all in the pursuit of a dream that had taken more than half his life to materialize. And now, standing on the edge of his property, staring at the pristine blue waters of the pool he had spent months designing, he felt, for the first time in years, something close to peace. It wasn't just a luxury feature in his home, it was a symbol, a testament to everything he had worked for, the culmination of all the sacrifices he had made along the way. His new home, a sprawling modern estate with clean lines and panoramic views of the surrounding hills, was exactly the kind of place he had imagined retiring in. The pool, sleek and sophisticated, sat like a jewel in the center of his backyard, its water shimmering under the afternoon sun. It was his space, his sanctuary, and it belonged to him alone. The neighborhood he had moved into was one of those places that seemed perfect on paper. The houses were well maintained, the streets lined with trees, the lawns meticulously trimmed, and the residents polite and welcoming, at least on the surface. Mark had never been the type to crave close relationships with his neighbors, and when he bought the house, he had done so for the property itself, not for the so-called sense of community that the area prided itself on. He had barely settled in when the invitations started arriving, casual get-togethers, homeowner meetings, community barbecues, all under the guise of getting to know each other. At first, he dismissed it as normal suburban friendliness, an attempt to make a newcomer feel welcome, but there was something about the way they insisted, the way they lingered at his front door, smiling just a little too wide, pushing just a little too hard. He had always been good at reading people, and there was something off about the way they looked at him, as if they expected something from him. The first real sign of trouble had come in the form of a seemingly innocent question at one of these neighborhood gatherings he had reluctantly attended. A woman in her 50s, perfectly put together with sharp, calculating eyes, had tilted her head and asked, "So Mark, now that you've got that beautiful pool of yours finished, have you given any thought to sharing it with the community?" There had been a murmur of agreement from the others around him, nods and polite smiles, but Mark had caught the expectation lurking behind their pleasant expressions. He had smiled back, shaking his head, and told them, as politely as possible, that the pool was private, built with his own money on his own property, and that he had no intention of turning it into a public amenity. The conversation had continued, shifting to other topics, but he had felt the energy in the room change, a slight but noticeable shift in the way they looked at him, as if they were reassessing something. From that moment on, the invitations stopped feeling friendly and started feeling like obligations. The casual waves from across the street turned into lingering stares, and the friendly conversations at the mailbox became oddly pointed. Mark had never cared much for other people's opinions, and he certainly wasn't about to start now, so he ignored it. But it wasn't long before the real pressure began. A letter arrived in his mailbox, neatly printed and formal, informing him that as a resident of the community he was encouraged to make his pool available for neighborhood events. It wasn't a demand, not yet, but the wording was careful, crafted in a way that made it clear that his refusal would not be well received. He tossed it in the trash without a second thought. Then came the complaints, small, petty things at first. Noise violations for music he hadn't played, warnings about his hedges being too tall, notices about garbage bins being left out too long, despite the fact that his were always taken in on time. It was clear what was happening. They were trying to make him uncomfortable, to squeeze him until he relented. But Mark had spent too many years negotiating deals with ruthless businessmen to be intimidated by a handful of nosy suburbanites. He ignored the warnings, paid the meaningless fines, and continued to enjoy his property exactly as he pleased. But the real escalation came one night when he woke to the sound of water rushing. At first, he thought it was just the pool's filtration system running louder than usual, but as he stepped onto his patio, he froze. The water in his pool was rapidly draining, a gaping black void where shimmering blue should have been. He rushed down to the edge, his pulse hammering, and saw that the main drainage valve had been forcibly opened. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had come onto his property in the dead of night and sabotaged his pool. He spent the next day reviewing the footage from his security cameras, but somehow there was nothing. The motion sensors had picked up nothing. The recordings were blank for the hours he knew someone had been there. It was as if whoever had done it had known exactly how to avoid detection. That was when he realized this wasn't just some bored teenagers playing pranks. This was calculated. This was personal. A few days later, another letter arrived, this time with stronger language. It was no longer a request, it was an expectation. He was urged to reconsider his position for the benefit of the community. It was signed not just by one person, but by multiple residents, each name neatly listed below the typed message. It was clear that they had no intention of backing down, and Mark, stubborn as he was, had no intention of giving in. He had worked too hard to let someone else dictate how he lived his life. Then, one night it happened. He had been out for the evening, and when he returned, the first thing he noticed was the silence too heavy, too unnatural. As he pulled into the driveway and stepped out of his car, he felt it immediately. The air was thick with dust, the scent of something dry and unnatural. His stomach twisted as he moved toward the backyard, and then he saw it. His pool. Gone. Where once there had been clear, inviting water, now there was nothing but sand. Tons of it, filling the space to the brim, burying what had once been the defining feature of his home. The tiles, the steps, the carefully designed lighting, all of it gone, swallowed beneath a sea of dry, golden grains. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he stepped closer, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't vandalism. This wasn't some childish prank. This was a message. And it was only the beginning. Mark stood at the edge of what had once been his pool, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he forced himself to absorb what he was seeing. The entire structure was gone, replaced by a solid, unbroken stretch of golden sand that spread evenly across the space where water had once shimmered under the sun. The sheer volume of it was staggering. This wasn't something a few people with shovels could have accomplished overnight. This had required planning, coordination, and equipment. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure that his pool, his private retreat, was erased from existence in the most invasive and permanent way possible. It was not just an act of destruction, it was an assertion of power. They wanted him to know that they could do this, that they could take away what was his without hesitation, and that there was nothing he could do to stop it. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. There was no use yelling into the night, no one to demand answers from. Whoever had done this was long gone, leaving nothing behind but the sand itself. He forced himself to take slow, measured breaths, trying to contain the rage boiling just beneath the surface. Losing control wouldn't fix anything. He needed to be methodical, deliberate. He needed to approach this the way he had approached every obstacle in his life, by breaking it down, identifying the weak points, and striking where it hurt the most. The first call he made was to the police. He had no illusions that they would be particularly helpful, but this was still destruction of private property, and if nothing else, he wanted to see how they would react. As he waited for them to arrive, he walked around the perimeter of his yard, looking for anything that might give him a clue as to how this had been done. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, no discarded tools or bags. Either they had covered their tracks exceptionally well, or someone had cleaned up after the fact. The sheer precision of it sent a chill down his spine. This was not the work of reckless vandals. When the patrol car finally pulled up in front of his house, Mark had already braced himself for disappointment. The two officers who stepped out were young, their expressions neutral as they approached, but there was something in the way their eyes flicked over his property that told him they had already made up their minds about the situation before he had even said a word. He explained what had happened, gesturing toward the sand-filled pit that had once been his pool, but the looks on their faces remained blank, almost indifferent. "Sir, do you have any security footage of the incident?" one of them asked after a moment. Mark clenched his jaw. "No. Somehow my cameras didn't record anything during the time frame this happened." The officer nodded, exchanging a glance with his partner. "That's unfortunate. Without footage or witnesses, it's going to be difficult to determine who's responsible." Mark narrowed his eyes. So that's it? Someone commits trespassing, uses heavy machinery to destroy part of my property, and you're telling me there's nothing you can do? The second officer let out a slow breath, as if he were already tired of the conversation. It's not that simple, sir. Look, whoever did this didn't technically damage your property, they just altered it. No windows were broken, no spray paint, no signs of forced entry. It's not a straightforward case of vandalism. Mark could feel his pulse hammering in his temples. So you're telling me that if someone sneaks onto my land and completely fills my pool with sand, it doesn't count as a crime? The first officer hesitated. It depends on whether they were legally allowed to do it. Mark's stomach turned. There it was. That subtle but deliberate phrasing. They weren't dismissing what had happened, they were implying that there might be a legal justification for it. His voice was dangerously low when he spoke again. You think this was sanctioned? The officers didn't answer immediately, but their silence spoke volumes. We're not saying that, sir, the first one finally said. But if this is tied to a neighborhood dispute or a property regulation issue, then it might fall under civil matters rather than criminal. Have you had any disagreements with your neighbors recently? Mark let out a cold laugh. I told them they couldn't use my pool. That's it. And now it's gone. The officers exchanged another glance. Then the first one gave him a small, almost sympathetic smile. We'll file a report, but I wouldn't get my hopes up for an investigation. If you want to take action, your best bet is to consult with a lawyer. And that was that. They left after another few minutes, having done nothing more than scribble a few notes and give him the kind of empty reassurances that meant absolutely nothing. Mark watched them drive off, his fists still clenched at his sides. He had been right to expect nothing from them. This wasn't going to be solved by the police. He went inside and immediately called his lawyer, explaining what had happened in clipped, precise sentences. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when he finished. They filled your pool with sand, his lawyer repeated, incredulous. Yes, Mark said tightly. And the cops all but told me it wasn't illegal. The lawyer exhaled. All right, first things first, you need to check if any permits were filed for this. If someone managed to do this without getting caught, it means they either had access to your property legally or they covered their tracks extremely well. If they had permission from the city or the homeowners board, they might have filed paperwork. I'll start looking into that on my end. But you should check with the planning department first thing in the morning. Mark thanked him, then hung up. He spent the rest of the night sitting in his dimly lit living room, staring out at the dark yard beyond the window, his mind running through every possibility. If permits had been filed, that meant someone had gone through official channels to make this happen. But if they hadn't, if this had been done entirely off the books, then it meant they had enough confidence in their control of the situation to not even bother covering themselves legally. Neither option was good. The next morning, he was at the city planning office as soon as it opened. The clerk at the desk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, tapped at her keyboard as he gave her his address, then frowned slightly at the screen. Well, that's strange, she murmured. Mark's fingers curled against the counter. What is? She turned the monitor slightly, showing him a scanned document. It was an official work order, signed and approved but not by him. Someone had authorized construction on his property using a name he had never seen before. Looks like someone claimed to be acting on your behalf, the clerk said, clicking on another file, and it was expedited. Usually these take weeks, but this was approved in just a few days. Mark stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Whoever had done this hadn't just gone behind his back, they had forged authorization in his name. That wasn't a neighborhood dispute. That was an operation. And he was about to find out just how deep it ran. Mark sat in his car outside the city planning office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The document he had just seen was still fresh in his mind, the forged authorization that had allowed someone to destroy his pool right under his nose. It had been so carefully orchestrated, so meticulously executed, that he couldn't help but feel a sharp sense of unease settle in his gut. This wasn't just a petty act of neighborhood retaliation, this was calculated. Whoever was behind it had resources, connections, and most importantly, the confidence to forge his name on official paperwork without a second thought. That meant they believed they were untouchable. That meant they thought they could do whatever they wanted, and he wouldn't be able to stop them. But they had miscalculated. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to think. Anger was a natural reaction, but anger without control was useless. He had spent his entire career negotiating deals, dismantling opposition, and making decisions that required patience and precision. If he let himself lash out recklessly, they would win. He had to be smarter. He had to move in a way they didn't expect. The first step was information. He needed to know exactly who had approved the document, who had expedited it, and most importantly, who stood to gain from it. His lawyer had promised to start digging into the paper trail, but Mark wasn't the kind of man to sit back and wait for answers to come to him. He walked back into the office, returning to the clerk who had pulled up his records. She looked up in mild surprise, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "I need a copy of that permit," he said, keeping his voice level but firm. "Printed, emailed, whatever you can do. I want every detail associated with it." She hesitated, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I don't know if I'm supposed to just hand that over," she murmured, though her tone lacked real resistance. Mark leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I understand. But someone used my name to authorize work on my property without my knowledge. That's fraud. I'm going to pursue legal action, and when this blows up, I don't think you want to be the person who withheld information from the victim." Her lips pressed together, and for a moment he thought she was going to refuse. Then, with a small sigh, she nodded and clicked a few buttons. The printer behind her whirred to life, spitting out several sheets of paper. She grabbed them, stacked them neatly, and slid them across the counter toward him. "I hope you know what you're getting into," she muttered as he took them. He frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Just be careful. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." His grip on the papers tightened. That was all she would say, but it was enough. He gave her a short nod and turned to leave, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. Back in his car, he scanned the documents carefully, his eyes moving over every name, every signature, every approval stamp. And then he saw it, the same name appeared twice in the authorization process. The permit had been expedited by someone named Henry Corbin, listed as an official compliance officer for neighborhood regulations. Mark had never heard of Henry Corbin. He pulled out his phone and ran a quick search, expecting to find some government official, some low-level bureaucrat with a history of approving minor construction permits. Instead, he found almost nothing. No LinkedIn profile, no work history, no real presence at all. The only mention of his name was on a small community website, where he was listed as an enforcement liaison for the neighborhood committee. Mark stared at the screen, his mind working quickly. Enforcement liaison. That wasn't a real position, it was something created to sound official while holding no real authority. It was a way to operate in the gray area of legality, a way to push people into compliance without actually being bound by government oversight. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as tension coiled in his muscles. Whoever Henry Corbin was, he wasn't just some pencil pusher approving paperwork. He was someone put in place to make things happen, someone who knew how to operate quietly, efficiently, and without leaving much of a trace. Mark's first instinct was to call his lawyer and push for legal action immediately, but something stopped him. If he went in too aggressively, if he pushed too soon, they would see it coming. They had already proven that they were willing to bend the rules to get what they wanted. If they caught wind that he was coming for them, they would adjust, cover their tracks, maybe even find a way to make the whole thing disappear before he could take real action. No, he needed to see the full picture first. He decided to start with something simple, a visit to the neighborhood committee's office. If Henry Corbin was tied to them, then they would know him. If they knew him, they might slip up and give him something he could use. The office was housed in a sleek, glass-front building just a few blocks from City Hall, the kind of place designed to make itself look more official than it actually was. Inside, the receptionist smiled a little too brightly as he stepped up to the desk. "Good afternoon. How can I help you today?" Mark returned the smile with one of his own, the kind he used in business meetings when he was sizing someone up. "I'm looking for Henry Corbin. Is he in today?" The receptionist's expression flickered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Corbin doesn't take walk-ins. If you'd like to schedule a meeting, I can." "I'll wait," Mark interrupted smoothly, leaning against the counter. "I don't mind." She hesitated, then glanced toward a closed office door in the back. "Let me see if he's available." She disappeared through the door, leaving Mark standing in the quiet lobby. He glanced around, taking in the framed community awards, the neatly arranged pamphlets about neighborhood initiatives. It all looked so normal, so polished. But the more perfect something looked on the surface, the more it usually had to hide underneath. A moment later, the receptionist returned, her smile now noticeably tighter. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Corbin isn't in the office today. Would you like to leave a message?" Mark studied her, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then he nodded. "Sure. Tell him Mark Hamilton stopped by. He'll know what it's about." He turned and walked out, but as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he caught something out of the corner of his eye, a movement from one of the tinted office windows. Someone was inside. Someone had been watching him. The message was clear. They knew he was looking, and they wanted him to know it. Mark exhaled slowly, shoving his hands into his pockets as he walked toward his car. His pulse was steady, his mind calm. They wanted him to back down, to feel like he was stepping into something too big to fight. But they had made a mistake. They had shown him that they were nervous, and that meant he was getting close to something they didn't want him to find. Mark drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel with just enough force to keep his hands steady. The moment he had walked out of that office, he knew without a doubt that he had rattled someone. The receptionist's hesitation, the unseen presence behind the tinted window, the sudden declaration that Henry Corbin wasn't in it, was all too convenient, too rehearsed. He had spent enough time around powerful people to know when someone was stalling, when they were buying time to figure out their next move. But what unnerved him most wasn't that they had tried to keep him from speaking to Corbin. It was that they had wanted him to know they were doing it. They could have lied more convincingly, could have sent him on a wild goose chase, but instead they had let him see the cracks forming. They were warning him, testing him, waiting to see if he would take the bait and push harder or if he would back off. But he had no intention of backing off. When he pulled into his driveway, he immediately noticed something was off. The air felt heavier, the silence around his property unnatural. He stepped out of his car slowly, scanning the perimeter of his house with careful eyes. Nothing looked disturbed, but the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. He unlocked his front door, pushed it open, and the moment he stepped inside, he knew someone had been there. The house wasn't ransacked. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture. Instead, it was the subtle things that sent a chill down his spine. His mail, which he always left stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, had been spread out haphazardly, as if someone had rifled through it. His living room lamp, which he distinctly remembered turning off before leaving, was on, casting an eerie glow over the space. And then there was his office. The door was slightly ajar, the way it never was when he left. He pushed it open fully, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. His desk drawers were closed, his papers neatly stacked, everything appeared untouched. But when he stepped closer, he saw it. A single sheet of paper, sitting in the center of his desk. It wasn't something he had left there. Slowly he picked it up, scanning the typed words in the dim light. "Walk away, before it gets worse." No name, no signature, just those 7 words, printed in crisp, bold letters. Mark exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to remain calm. He had expected pushback, but this was an escalation. They had broken into his home not to steal, not to destroy, but to send a message. They wanted him to know that they could reach him anytime, anywhere, that if he kept pushing, they would make sure he regretted it. But they had miscalculated. Fear was a weapon, and Mark had spent too many years learning how to wield it against others to let it be used against him now. If anything, their warning had given him exactly what he needed, a confirmation that he was on the right track. People didn't resort to threats unless they had something to lose. And now whoever was behind this knew that Mark was getting too close to whatever they were trying to keep buried. He set the note down, methodically locking every window and door in his house before heading to his bedroom. He didn't sleep much that night, instead sitting in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for any sign that they might come back. They didn't, but the message was clear. The next morning he called his lawyer. "I need to know everything there is to know about Henry Corbin," he said, skipping pleasantries. "I don't care how you find it. Just get me whatever you can." His lawyer didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Give me a day," and hung up. Mark spent the day reinforcing his security. He upgraded his camera system, installed additional locks, and made sure that the next time someone tried to get into his house, they wouldn't be able to do it without setting off an alarm. He wasn't stupid. He knew that cameras wouldn't stop them if they really wanted to get inside. But this wasn't just about protection. It was about showing them that he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't going to make it easy for them. By the time his lawyer called him back, Mark was more than ready. "There's almost nothing on Corbin," his lawyer said, sounding frustrated. "No employment records, no tax history, nothing that places him anywhere before 5 years ago. It's like he just appeared out of nowhere." Mark tightened his grip on his phone. "That's not possible." "I thought the same thing," his lawyer admitted. "But then I found something. It's buried deep, but Corbin's name showed up in connection with a real estate firm. A very specific one." Mark already knew the answer before the lawyer even said it. "The one buying out properties in your neighborhood," the lawyer confirmed. Mark closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. It made perfect sense. The company that had been systematically pressuring homeowners to sell, that had been using underhanded tactics to drive people out, had someone embedded within the neighborhood committee. Corbin wasn't just a liaison, he was a plant, someone put there to ensure that resistance was minimal, to make sure that anyone who refused to fall in line had their life made unbearable until they caved. And now Mark was officially in their crosshairs. He ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. He needed leverage, something he could use to push back before they pushed him further. "Do you have a name for whoever actually owns the company?" His lawyer hesitated. That's where it gets tricky. The company itself is registered under a shell corporation, and the ownership trail leads in circles. But there's a name that keeps coming up in the filings, someone who's been signing off on a lot of the bigger acquisitions. Mark opened his eyes. "Who?" A pause. "Richard Alcott." Mark's blood went cold. Richard Alcott wasn't just anyone. He was a high-level developer with a reputation for ruthless business practices, a man who had been behind some of the biggest and most controversial real estate deals in the state. He wasn't the kind of man who operated in the shadows. He was the kind of man who had other people do that for him. And now Mark was standing directly in his way. For the first time since this had all started, he felt the weight of what he was up against. This wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute, or even about someone trying to force him to sell. This was about power, about control. And if Alcott was involved, it meant that Mark wasn't just dealing with a group of petty suburban tyrants anymore. He was dealing with someone who had the resources, the money, and the connections to make problems disappear permanently. And if Mark wasn't careful, he was going to be one of them. But as he stood there, processing the full scope of what he was up against, something inside him hardened. He had spent his entire career dealing with men like Alcott, men who thought that just because they had power, they were untouchable. He had watched them manipulate, destroy, and discard anyone who stood in their way, and he had learned one thing: the only way to beat them was to hit them where they weren't expecting it. Alcott had made a mistake. He had underestimated Mark, and Mark was about to show him just how big of a mistake that was. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in his dimly lit living room, a whiskey glass resting untouched beside him, his mind racing through every possible scenario. Richard Alcott. The name alone carried enough weight to make most people back down, to make them reconsider whatever petty dispute they thought they had. Alcott wasn't just a real estate mogul, he was a tactician, a man who played long, calculated games, who never made a move unless he was sure the board was set in his favor. If he was involved, it meant that everything the fake permits, the sabotage, the pressure from the neighborhood wasn't just a string of isolated incidents. It was all part of a larger, well-executed strategy. And now Mark was sitting directly in the middle of it. But if Alcott thought he was just another name to be crossed off a list, another homeowner who could be manipulated or intimidated into submission, he was sorely mistaken. Mark had built his life on knowing when to push and when to pull back, when to play the game and when to burn the whole damn board. He wasn't going to be the next casualty in whatever scheme Alcott was running. If anything, he was about to become the biggest problem the man had ever faced. At 6 a.m., Mark was already dressed and out the door, driving straight to his lawyer's office. The receptionist barely had time to register his presence before he was pushing through the glass doors and into the conference room where his attorney, David Langley, was nursing his first coffee of the day. "I take it this is urgent," Langley muttered, setting down his cup as Mark threw the printed documents onto the table. "Understatement," Mark replied. "We need to move. Now." Langley adjusted his glasses, scanning the paperwork carefully. "I did more digging last night," he said. "Alcott's involvement isn't direct. He's using a network of shell companies, intermediaries who handle the dirty work so that nothing traces back to him. But he's signing off on all the major deals. That means he's aware of everything happening in your neighborhood, including what's happening to you." Mark leaned forward. "Then we hit him where it hurts." Langley sighed, rubbing his temple. "Easier said than done. Legally, he's insulated. There's no direct link between him and the tactics they've been using to force people out. If we go after him now, all we have is speculation. We need more." Mark exhaled slowly. He had expected that answer, but it didn't make it any less frustrating. He needed leverage, something undeniable, something that could force Alcott's hand before they had the chance to shut him down completely. Then an idea formed. It was risky, but it might be the only way to shake something loose. "I need to meet Henry Corbin," Mark said. Langley frowned. "The committee liaison? Why?" "Because he's the weak link. Alcott operates from a distance, but Corbin is the one making things happen on the ground. He's the one signing off on these bogus permits, the one pushing the pressure tactics. If anyone knows where the cracks in Alcott's operation are, it's him." Langley hesitated. "You think he'll talk?" Mark's smile was cold. "If I give him the right reason." It didn't take long to find him. Henry Corbin wasn't exactly a public figure, but Mark had already seen his name enough times to know where to start looking. He drove to the neighborhood committee office again, but this time he didn't bother going through the front desk. He parked across the street, watching the building for over an hour until Corbin finally stepped out, dressed in his usual pressed slacks and an expensive blazer, the kind that screamed self-importance. Mark waited until Corbin was a few blocks away before pulling up beside him. The man barely had time to register the vehicle before Mark rolled down the window. "Get in." Corbin blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me." Mark's expression didn't waver. "We need to talk. And I don't think you want to do it out here." For a moment, Corbin hesitated, looking around as if expecting someone to intervene. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. Mark pulled away from the curb, driving in silence for a few minutes before finally speaking. "You know who I am." Corbin shifted uncomfortably. "I know of you," Good Mark said. "Then you know why you're here." Corbin let out a nervous chuckle. "Look, if this is about your property, I already told you." Mark cut him off. "Save it. I know who you work for. I know Alcott is behind this. And I know that you're the one signing off on the paperwork that's forcing people out of their homes." Corbin's face hardened. "I don't know what you think you know, but..." Mark slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop in the middle of an empty side street. Corbin flinched, his hands gripping the seat. "Let's skip the bullshit," Mark said calmly. "You're a middleman, a disposable asset. Alcott gives the orders, you carry them out, and if something goes wrong, you're the one left holding the bag. Tell me, Henry, how much do you think he values you?" Corbin swallowed, his gaze flickering to the door handle, as if debating whether to make a run for it. Mark continued, his voice measured. "I don't need you to confess. I just need you to understand something. Right now, I'm the only person standing between you and what's coming. Alcott isn't untouchable. No matter how much he wants you to believe otherwise, when this blows up he's going to need a fall guy. And that's going to be you. Corbin's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Mark leaned in slightly. But here's the thing, I don't need to take you down. In fact, I'd rather not. What I need is information, something solid. Give me that, and when this all goes to hell, I'll make sure you're not the one they come for. Silence filled the car. Corbin stared ahead, his breathing shallow. Finally, he exhaled sharply. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. Corbin was quiet for a long moment, then, almost reluctantly, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. After a few seconds, he turned the screen toward Mark. This is what you want. Mark took the phone, scanning the messages quickly. They weren't just instructions, they were direct orders. From Alcott's team. They outlined the tactics, the pressure points, the legal loopholes they were exploiting to force homeowners out. And at the bottom of the thread was something even more damning, a direct message from Alcott himself, giving final approval on Mark's property. Mark felt a slow smile spread across his face. This was it. This was the leverage he needed. He handed the phone back. Make sure that doesn't get deleted. Corbin nodded stiffly. Mark started the car again, his mind already racing through the next steps. Alcott had played his hand, had shown just how far he was willing to go. But now Mark had something even more valuable than money, than influence. He had proof. And soon Richard Alcott was going to realize just how big of a mistake he had made. Mark sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with fingers that had long since turned numb, his mind working through the possibilities at a speed that made his pulse hammer against his ribs. He had the proof. He had the messages. He had the direct orders that tied everything, every permit, every forged authorization, every forced eviction back to Richard Alcott. And yet, as he stared at the dim glow of his dashboard, he knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Alcott had built his empire on erasing problems before they became threats, on ensuring that anyone who stood in his way either disappeared, settled, or found themselves buried under so much legal bureaucracy that they lost the will to fight. Mark wasn't naive enough to think that presenting these messages to the authorities would be enough to bring a man like Alcott down. The system wasn't built to punish men like him. It was built to protect them. But that didn't mean Mark was out of options. He had spent his entire career navigating cutthroat negotiations, dismantling opposition, and turning power plays back on the people who thought they could control him. Alcott had resources, influence, and a network of people willing to do his dirty work, but Mark had something far more dangerous, nothing to lose. The moment Alcott had crossed into his life, the moment he had sent his men to destroy his property and make him a target, he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had given Mark a reason to see this through to the end. He scrolled through the messages again, memorizing the names, the timestamps, the tone of the exchanges. There was a pattern to them, a hierarchy of power. Alcott didn't micromanage, he gave the orders, but the real execution was handled by his team, by men who weren't insulated by layers of shell corporations and legal loopholes. They were the ones who had taken action, the ones who had left behind digital fingerprints. And that was what Mark needed to exploit. He picked up his phone and dialed Henry Corbin. The man answered on the third ring, his voice tense. Jesus Hamilton, do you ever sleep? Mark's lips curled in a humorless smirk. Not when I'm this close. There was a beat of silence, then a quiet sigh. You looked through them, didn't you? I did, and I know exactly how to use them. Corbin cursed under his breath. Look, I gave you what you wanted, but if you think this is going to be some easy takedown. I don't think anything about this will be easy, Mark cut in. But I also know that the men who work for Alcott aren't as untouchable as he is. They're the ones who signed the contracts, who made the calls, who gave the orders that can actually be traced. If one of them flips, it cracks the whole foundation. Corbin let out a low, humorless laugh. You think anyone in Alcott's circle is going to turn on him? I don't need all of them, Mark said calmly. I just need one. He could almost hear Corbin grinding his teeth on the other end of the line. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "There's a guy. Not one of the executives, but close enough to the operation that he's seen how it works. Name's Ellis Carter. He handles acquisitions, but more importantly, he's the one who negotiates settlements when people resist. If anyone has enough dirt to be useful, it's him." Mark committed the name to memory. "Where do I find him?" Corbin hesitated. "He has an office downtown, but you won't get anything out of him in a formal meeting. If you really want to corner him, he's at the Elms Club every Friday night. Drinks too much, gets too comfortable. That's where you make your move." Mark checked the time. Friday. He didn't even hesitate. "Then that's where I'll be." The Elms Club was exactly what he expected: dark, expensive, and filled with men who had too much money and not enough morality. Mark didn't bother blending in. He walked through the doors with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged, scanning the room until he spotted his target. Ellis Carter sat at a private booth, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him, laughing at something the man beside him had said. He looked exactly like the type of executive Mark had spent years outmaneuvering: slick, well-dressed, and just arrogant enough to think he was untouchable. Mark didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight to the booth, sliding into the seat across from Carter without so much as a greeting. The laughter died instantly, Carter's brows furrowing in confusion before irritation took over. "Do I know you?" he asked, his tone clipped. Mark smiled, leaning forward slightly. "No, but I know you." Carter exchanged a glance with the man beside him, who took the silent cue and slid out of the booth without another word. Once they were alone, Mark pulled out his phone and placed it on the table, screen up. He tapped the screen once, bringing up the messages Corbin had given him, then turned it so Carter could see. For the first time that night, the executive's face paled. Mark watched him carefully. "I assume you recognize these." Carter swallowed, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Where the hell did you get this?" "Doesn't matter," Mark said. "What matters is that I have them. And more importantly, I know exactly how to use them." Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're doing," Mark chuckled. "No, Carter, you don't know what you're doing. Because right now you're on the losing side of this equation. Alcott doesn't care about you. If this blows up, he'll cut you loose without a second thought. And based on what I've read, you've been a little more involved in this operation than you probably should have been. Which means if someone goes down for this, it's going to be you." Carter ran a hand through his hair, his bravado starting to crack. "What do you want?" Mark's smile was cold. "I want Alcott. And you're going to help me get him." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, finally, Carter let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "You don't get it," he muttered. "Alcott isn't just going to let this go. He's going to come after you." Mark leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Then he should have thought twice before coming after me first." Carter hesitated for another long moment before finally reaching for his phone. His hands were shaking as he scrolled through his messages, his lips pressed into a tight line. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he slid the phone across the table. "This is everything I have," he said quietly. "Every directive, every email, every deal I was a part of. But if you're going after Alcott, you'd better be ready. Because once you start this, there's no going back." Mark picked up the phone, scanning the messages quickly. It was exactly what he needed. The missing link, the proof that tied everything directly to Alcott. He slid the phone back and met Carter's gaze. "I was never going back to begin with." Mark had been in high-stakes negotiations before. He had spent years in rooms where every word, every pause, and every glance was a weapon, where fortunes were won and lost based on who could keep their nerve the longest. But this wasn't business. This wasn't about leverage or closing a deal. This was about something far more personal, something that had been set in motion the moment Richard Alcott had decided that Mark Hamilton was a problem that needed to be erased. Now, sitting in his car outside Alcott's private estate, Mark felt the weight of every decision that had led him here. The folder in the passenger seat contained everything: emails, documents, signed directives, all tying Alcott directly to the illegal operations in Mark's neighborhood and beyond. It was enough to blow the entire scheme apart, to bring lawsuits, criminal charges, and public scandal down on Alcott's empire. It was the kind of evidence that men like Alcott spent their entire lives making sure never saw the light of day. And now Mark was going to make sure it did. But first he wanted to see the man face to face. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his jacket as he approached the front gate. A camera tilted toward him, scanning his face, and then a voice crackled over the intercom. "State your name and business." Mark smiled faintly. "Tell Alcott I have something he wants." A long pause. Then, the gate buzzed open. The house was as extravagant as he had expected: sleek, modern architecture, vast floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the valley below, the kind of place designed to make visitors feel small in comparison. But Mark wasn't here to be impressed. He was here to end this. A butler led him through the house, past art that had probably been stolen from some crumbling European estate, past furniture that no one actually sat on, past doors that likely concealed secrets Alcott would kill to keep buried. And then, finally, they entered a dimly lit study, where Richard Alcott sat behind a massive mahogany desk, sipping a glass of dark amber liquid, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. He looked exactly as Mark had imagined: polished, composed, and utterly indifferent. A man who had spent his life controlling everything and everyone around him. Mark didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He strode forward, dropping the thick folder onto the desk between them. Alcott didn't flinch, didn't even glance at it. He simply exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down carefully before meeting Mark's gaze. "I assume you think you've won," Alcott said, his voice smooth, practiced. Mark tilted his head slightly. "No assumptions, just facts." Alcott finally opened the folder, flipping through the pages at a leisurely pace, as if they were of mild interest but nothing more. When he looked up again, there was something almost amused in his eyes. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this?" he asked. "Take it to the police? The media? You really think a few documents are enough to bring me down?" Mark leaned in slightly. "They are when they're accompanied by a sworn statement from Ellis Carter." For the first time, Alcott's expression flickered. It was barely perceptible, but Mark saw it: the faint tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed just a little harder into the pages in front of him. "You should have left this alone," Hamilton Alcott murmured, closing the folder. "You had every opportunity to walk away." Mark smiled coldly. "So did you." Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Then Alcott let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "You know what fascinates me about men like you," he mused. "You come into my world thinking you understand the rules, thinking you have some kind of moral high ground, but you don't. You're just like the rest of them. You think because you have this." He tapped the folder lightly: "that it makes you powerful, that it makes you untouchable. But power isn't about information, Hamilton. It's about control, and right now you have none." Mark let the words settle, let Alcott believe, just for a second, that he still held the upper hand. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen once before setting it face up on the desk. The screen showed a live news broadcast. Alcott's name was already on the ticker. Mark saw it happen in real time the moment realization dawned in Alcott's eyes, the moment he understood that the information in that folder wasn't just a threat, wasn't just leverage. It was already out. It was already spreading. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Mark leaned back in his chair, watching as the carefully constructed world of Richard Alcott began to fracture. "You were right about one thing," Mark said quietly. "Power is about control. And right now you're losing yours." Alcott's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles going white. For the first time since Mark had walked into the room, the man looked shaken, his usual composure slipping at the edges. "You think this will destroy me?" Alcott asked, his voice a low growl. Mark stood, adjusting his jacket. "No, but it'll make damn sure you never try this again." Alcott didn't move, didn't speak as Mark turned and walked away, leaving the man alone in the dimly lit study, surrounded by the weight of his own collapsing empire. By the time Mark stepped outside, the cool night air filling his lungs, he could already hear the distant sound of sirens. The first cracks had formed, and soon the rest would follow. Alcott might survive this, might claw his way out through legal loopholes and settlements, but he would never be the same. His name, his reputation, his influence, it would all be tainted, forever tied to the corruption he had spent his life trying to keep hidden. And as Mark drove away, feeling the tension in his shoulders finally begin to ease, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The battle had been long. The cost had been high, but in the end he had won.